The night was darker than any Avari Tsuma had ever known. The dim lights of the human colony outpost barely illuminated the narrow streets, their glow faltering beneath the heavy haze that clung to this planet's atmosphere. It was a far cry from the brilliant, sky-spanning spires of her empire's capital. Avari tugged the hood of her borrowed cloak tighter around her face, hiding the faint iridescence of her skin that might draw unwanted attention. She moved with purpose, but her mind churned in turmoil. Her people had turned on her. Allies she'd trusted for years had betrayed her for power, for influence, for reasons she couldn't yet fully comprehend. She'd escaped with little more than her life, and now she was stranded here on a human outpost at the edge of civilization, cut off from everything she had known. As Avari approached a dimly lit workshop at the edge of the settlement, her breathing slowed. She had chosen this colony specifically because it was far enough from any major trade routes to remain unnoticed. The workshop's owner, Ellis Carter, had been pointed out to her as a reliable mechanic, someone who could fix anything that came through his doors. She needed his help. Her ship's shuttle was a mess after the frantic escape, and she couldn't make it any farther without a functioning engine. "Hey, you open?" she asked, stepping through the doorway. Ellis looked up from under the hood of a small hovercraft, wiping his hands on a rag. His gray coveralls were streaked with grease, and his dark hair was in disarray. He was tall and lean, with a calm, steady energy that Avari found immediately disarming. He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Sure," he said, nodding toward a workbench. "What do you need?" "My shuttle, it's down at the docks. I need it operational again as soon as possible," she said, careful to keep her voice even. "I can pay." Ellis chuckled dryly, tossing the rag onto the bench. "Don't see many shuttles in working condition out here, let alone ones that look like they've been through a war zone. You're lucky it's not a total write-off. I'll take a look, but no promises." She hesitated before responding. "Thank you. I appreciate it." "Name's Ellis," he said, extending a hand. "Avari," she replied after a pause, shaking it firmly. Their hands met briefly, and Ellis noted the smooth, almost too perfect texture of her skin. He didn't comment, though. People came through this colony with all kinds of oddities, genetic modifications, alien heritage, or just plain luck. Avari, for her part, was surprised by the straightforward sincerity in his eyes. No suspicion, no deference, just a simple willingness to help. "Let's go check it out," he said, grabbing a battered toolkit and heading for the door. Avari followed, her sharp gaze scanning the quiet streets as they walked. She felt exposed without the protection of her guards or the comforting weight of her ceremonial staff. Here, she was just another traveler, and perhaps that was a blessing. Ellis whistled as they approached the docks, a low tune that blended with the sound of distant machinery. "What brings you out here, anyway?" he asked. "Personal business," she said curtly. "Nothing worth discussing." "Fair enough," he said. "I don't pry, but I'll tell you this. Folks here don't ask many questions. You just keep your head down, fix what's broken, and get by." Avari wasn't sure if that was reassuring or not. She didn't have the luxury of just getting by. She needed to rebuild, to survive, to find a way back to her people. But for now, she had to trust that this human wouldn't ask too many questions. They reached her shuttle, its sleek, battered hull standing out among the more utilitarian vessels docked nearby. Ellis whistled again, this time in genuine admiration. "This is one hell of a ship," he said. "You sure you don't want to trade it in for something a bit more manageable?" "It's all I have," Avari said. "Can you fix it?" "I'll do what I can," he said, dropping his toolkit with a thud. "It's gonna take some time, though. Might want to make yourself comfortable while I run diagnostics." Avari crossed her arms, watching him work. Ellis moved with practiced efficiency, his hands deftly navigating the shuttle's complex systems. She couldn't help but notice the confidence in his movements, the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and betrayal she had left behind. "So, Avari," Ellis said after a while, his voice breaking the silence. "You a pilot?" "Of sorts," she replied. You fly a ship like this and call it of sorts? That's modest. She almost smiled, but caught herself. I manage. Ellis chuckled. Well, if you're half as good a pilot as this ship deserves, you'll be back in the air in no time. Avari's gaze softened slightly. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a glimmer of hope. Not from grand schemes or elaborate plans, but from the simple, straightforward way this human approached his work. She wasn't sure if she could trust him yet, but something about Ellis's unassuming manner made her want to try. Thank you, she said, her voice quieter this time. Just doing my job, Ellis replied. But as he looked up and caught her eyes, there was something unspoken there. A mutual understanding that, for now, they were on the same side. Ellis wiped his hands on a grease-stained towel as Avari adjusted her hood and glanced around the workshop. The repair on her shuttle would take more than a day, leaving her temporarily grounded. She hadn't expected to rely on this human mechanic so much, but she needed both his tools and his local knowledge if she was going to stay hidden. So, Ellis began, breaking the silence. You gonna tell me where you're from, or is that still classified information? Avari stiffened slightly, keeping her gaze fixed on the workbench where Ellis had just set down a diagnostic tool. Let's just say it's far from here, she replied. Far from here, Ellis repeated with a raised eyebrow. That could mean anything from the next colony over to another quadrant entirely. Let's keep it ambiguous, Avari said. It's safer that way. Fair enough. Ellis shrugged, then gestured to the makeshift stool in the corner. You're welcome to stay here while I work. There's not much in the way of luxury, but it beats sitting out in the cold. Avari nodded reluctantly and took the offered seat. The workshop's air was heavy with the scent of engine oil and welding fumes, a stark contrast to the clean, perfumed halls of her palace. Yet, as she watched Ellis move efficiently around the space, she found herself oddly fascinated. He worked without hesitation, his hands deftly connecting wires, tightening bolts, and studying readouts. There was something unpretentious about him. Do you always work alone? She asked after a long pause. Most of the time, Ellis replied, not looking up. Out here, it's just simpler that way. I know the tools, I know the ships, and I don't have to argue with anyone about how to get things done. What about you? What about me? Avari echoed, frowning slightly. Before you ended up here, did you have a crew? Friends? Family? Avari's hand tightened on her cloak's fabric. I had people. I had responsibilities. Ellis glanced at her, his expression thoughtful but not probing. Sounds like you're used to running the show. I was, she admitted. But things changed. They always do, Ellis said with a small smile. The trick is figuring out how to keep moving when they do. Avari didn't respond immediately, her gaze falling to the floor. She wasn't used to such straightforward, grounded advice. Most of the people in her life had offered polished platitudes or carefully calculated reassurances. Ellis, on the other hand, seemed to speak his mind without overthinking it. It was disarming in its simplicity. You have a lot of experience with that? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Plenty, Ellis said with a short laugh. Out here, you either adapt or you break down. And trust me, I've had more than my share of broken engines and bad parts. Avari allowed herself a small smile. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, Ellis admitted. But making it sound simple helps me get through it. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the only sounds coming from the hum of machinery and the occasional clink of a tool. Avari watched Ellis carefully, noting how his confidence seemed to come from a place of experience rather than arrogance. It was clear he knew his craft well and took pride in it. There was no pretense, no facade, just a man doing what he was good at. What's next? Avari asked after a while. Next? Ellis repeated, looking up at her. Yes, for you, for this place. What's your plan? She asked, genuinely curious. Ellis set down his wrench and leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. Plan's pretty simple. Keep fixing what comes my way. If I can keep the outpost ships running and their systems from failing, they'll keep coming back. That's what keeps the lights on. You're content with that? She pressed. No desire to leave, to explore something greater? He gave her a long look, then shrugged. I've been to bigger places, seen busier docks and fancier ports. None of it feels like home. Out here, people leave me to do my job and I leave them to do theirs. That's enough for me. Avari studied him for a moment, then nodded. I can respect that. Glad to hear it, Ellis said, grinning. Now, what about you? Once this shuttle of yours is up and running, what's your big plan? Her expression turned guarded again. I don't know yet. That so? He asked, picking up a spanner and turning back to the open engine panel. Sounds like you're more of a planner than you're letting on. She hesitated, then replied, Sometimes, the best plan is no plan at all. Guess that's something we can agree on, Ellis said with a chuckle. At least until I get that shuttle working. Avari let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in what felt like ages, she found herself enjoying the company of another person. Not because they offered her deference or followed her commands, but because they treated her like an equal. It was a strange feeling, and one she wasn't sure how to process. For now, she would just let it be. Avari crouched beside the engine casing, her delicate fingers holding a diagnostic probe steady as Ellis scanned the readings. The once pristine shuttle still bore the scars of her escape. Jagged scorch marks, warped panels, and a cockpit windshield so blackened she'd had to rely solely on sensors to land. Now, with Ellis's help, she was starting to believe the vessel might fly again. You've got power surges in 3 separate circuits? Ellis muttered, pointing at the tablet in his hand. This one here. He leaned over her shoulder, showing her the display. That's a fried regulator. Without it, your stabilizers will never align. Avari glanced up at him, her expression cool but her curiosity unmistakable. And you think it's a simple replacement? Simple as long as we can find a part that fits, he said, stepping back to rummage through a stack of parts bins. If not, we might need to jerry-rig something. Shouldn't be too bad. Your confidence is refreshing, she said, a hint of wry humor in her tone. I don't know about confidence, Ellis replied, tossing a couple of mismatched parts aside. I'd call it optimism. Do humans always distinguish between the two? Ellis smirked, finally selecting a component. If we didn't, we'd never get anything done. Confidence keeps you going when you know what you're doing. Optimism? That's what keeps you from giving up when you don't. Avari gave him a sidelong glance. You're surprisingly philosophical for a mechanic. I'll take that as a compliment, Ellis said. And here, this might work for that regulator. He handed her the part, and she turned it over in her hands. This is compatible? With a little tweaking, yeah, Ellis said. Hand me the microcaliper. Avari handed him the tool, and he began making precise adjustments to the replacement regulator. She watched him closely, noting the steady precision in his movements. It was a stark contrast to the chaos she'd faced recently. Everything about Ellis seemed grounded, practical, and oddly calming. Where did you learn all this? She asked after a moment. Your repairs, your technical knowledge? Here and there, Ellis said. I grew up on a colony ship. Lots of broken things, not a lot of people to fix them. So I learned. Spent some time with engineers, shipwrights. You pick things up. She nodded slowly, still watching him work. It's not something you were trained for formally? Ellis laughed. No formal academy, if that's what you mean. Just hands-on experience, a little trial and error, and a lot of swearing. That's not entirely dissimilar to how I learned, Avari admitted, surprising herself. She rarely shared personal details, but Ellis's casual openness seemed to invite it. My upbringing didn't allow for mistakes, though. Every decision I made was scrutinized. Sounds exhausting, Ellis said without looking up. No room to mess up means no room to learn. Yes, she said quietly. Exactly. For a while, they worked in companionable silence, passing tools back and forth as Ellis guided Avari through each step of the repair. At one point, she found herself adjusting a connection inside the engine's control housing, her hands just inches from his. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she pulled back instinctively, her expression unreadable. "Sorry," Ellis said, not missing a beat. "Didn't mean to crowd you." "It's fine," she said quickly. "I'm just not used to working closely with others." He glanced at her. "No offense, but I'm starting to think you've spent most of your life running solo." Avari hesitated, then nodded. "More or less." "Well," Ellis said, tightening a bolt, "at least you've got me for now. I'd say I make decent company." She didn't respond right away, but her lips curved slightly. "Decent is acceptable." Ellis laughed. "I'll take that as a glowing review." They continued to piece the shuttle back together, each hour bringing them closer to a working vessel. Avari found herself settling into the rhythm of their collaboration. Ellis would offer a straightforward suggestion. She'd counter with a more refined approach, and somehow they'd meet in the middle. It wasn't the strict, hierarchical dynamic she was accustomed to. It was an exchange of ideas, a blending of skills. As the evening wore on, the light inside the workshop dimmed, and Ellis finally set his tools down. "We're getting there. Just a few more parts and she'll be good as new." "Thank you," Avari said, looking at him more directly than she had before. "You've been helpful." "Just doing my job," Ellis said, smiling. "But thanks. Nice to hear it." Avari stood, brushing a hand against the sleeve of her borrowed cloak. For the first time in a long while, she felt a faint sense of stability, not from her own power or position, but from the steady presence of another person. It was unfamiliar, but not entirely unwelcome. The workshop bustled with more activity than usual. Avari had pulled back her sleeves and taken up a welder's torch, her once pristine hands now bearing the faint, smudged stains of machine work. Ellis, on the other side of the shuttle, was elbow-deep in a control panel, muttering to himself as he tightened yet another bolt. "This piece wasn't designed with anyone's sanity in mind," Ellis grumbled, shaking his head. "Perhaps it was meant to ensure only the most patient technicians could repair it." Avari replied dryly, her sharp gaze fixed on the uneven weld she was adjusting. Ellis chuckled. "Or the most stubborn. Guess that makes us qualified." Avari didn't respond immediately. Instead, she focused on smoothing out the weld, the bright flare of the torch casting flickering shadows across the workshop's walls. In her world, she had never touched such tools. There had always been others to perform these tasks, engineers, technicians, aides. Now, standing side by side with a human who seemed to thrive on getting his hands dirty, she found herself strangely content. "Not bad for a first try," Ellis remarked as he walked over to inspect her work. "A little uneven, but solid. You're a quick learner." "I'm used to adapting," she said, glancing at him. "It's necessary. Still, not everyone takes to welding this fast. I've seen seasoned techs botch a joint twice as bad." He grinned, clearly trying to encourage her. Avari straightened, placing the torch on the workbench. "I don't enjoy failure." "Neither do I," Ellis said, leaning back against the bench. "But out here a little failure's expected. It's how you figure out what works." She crossed her arms. "I prefer to know what works from the start." "Well, that'd be nice," Ellis admitted. "But if I waited until I was sure, I'd never fix anything. Half the time, I'm just trying stuff out until something clicks." Avari tilted her head, considering his words. "You're more comfortable with uncertainty than I am." "I'd say so," Ellis replied. "But I'd also say it's what's kept me alive. Plans fall apart, tools break, and sometimes you just have to trust yourself to handle it in the moment." They shared a brief, understanding look before Ellis straightened up and motioned toward the shuttle. "All right, let's see how our work holds up. Fire up the main power line and we'll check the diagnostics." Avari moved to the control panel, her movements swift and deliberate. Within moments, the shuttle hummed to life, the dull glow of the cockpit instruments reflecting in her eyes. She didn't smile, but there was a subtle lift in her expression, a faint satisfaction. "Looks like it's holding," Ellis said, glancing at the readouts. "We're getting good power flow." "It's functional," Avari agreed, her tone neutral. "For now." Functional sounds like a compliment coming from you, Ellis teased. I'll take it. Avari's gaze flicked to him. You have a habit of interpreting the smallest success as praise. Ellis shrugged. Gotta celebrate the wins, no matter how small. Otherwise, what's the point? She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer, looking over his shoulder at the readings. This will get me off planet. It'll do more than that, Ellis said. This shuttle's built for long hauls. Once we're done, you'll be able to go wherever you need. She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what do you want in return? Ellis turned to face her, his expression open and unguarded. I want to see this thing fly again. That's it. I mean, if you've got some credits or spare parts, I won't say no, but mostly, I just like fixing things. Avari searched his face for any sign of deceit but found none. The straightforward honesty of his answer was disarming. You're an unusual human, she said quietly. Coming from someone like you, I'll take that as a compliment, Ellis said with a grin. The corner of her mouth twitched upward, so faint it was almost imperceptible. Perhaps it is. They stood there for a moment, the hum of the shuttle filling the silence. Avari took a step back, her usual composure returning. Let's get back to work, she said, picking up the diagnostic pad. There's still much to be done. You got it, boss, Ellis replied, returning to his two. A joke made it easier for her to forget the weight of her former life. For now, there was only the shuttle, the tools, and the quiet companionship of a human who never once treated her as anything other than an equal. Ellis leaned against the side of the shuttle, arms crossed, watching Avari pace. The tension between them was palpable. A few colonists had passed by earlier, looking a little too closely at the sleek craft docked in his workshop. Now Avari seemed on edge, her normally measured demeanor slipping into restlessness. You're sure no one around here would recognize me? She asked, stopping mid-step to face him. Her hood was pulled low, but her expression was sharp. Positive, Ellis said calmly. The people here don't pay much attention to visitors. As long as you keep a low profile, they'll just assume you're another drifter. He gave her a faint smirk. Besides, most of them only care about whose drinks to buy at the cantina. Avari didn't look reassured. It only takes one person looking too closely. If my enemies catch wind that I'm here, they won't, Ellis interrupted. He pushed off the shuttle and stepped closer, his voice steady. Look, we've got the shuttle mostly back online. 1 or 2 more fixes, and you'll be gone before anyone thinks twice. She studied him for a moment, her intense gaze searching his. You're certain? Certain enough, he said. I've got no reason to lie to you. Avari sighed and glanced toward the workshop's main door. I hope you're right. I can't afford to be wrong. Ellis chuckled dryly. Nobody can, but that's life, isn't it? You take your shot, and you hope it hits. Her brow furrowed slightly. A rather casual philosophy. Works for me, Ellis said. He motioned toward the control console inside the shuttle. Come on, let's finish up. The faster we're done, the faster you're in the air and out of here. She hesitated, then nodded and followed him back inside. The shuttle's interior was small but efficient. Ellis grabbed a tool from the floor compartment and started checking the panel readings. Avari stood nearby, arms crossed as she watched him work. Do you ever miss it? She asked suddenly. Ellis glanced up. Miss what? Whatever life you left behind, Avari clarified. Before this workshop, this colony. Ellis straightened, leaning against the panel. Not really, he said after a moment. I didn't leave much behind. A couple of jobs that didn't go anywhere, some people who moved on. Out here, at least I know what to expect. That sounds lonely, Avari remarked, tilting her head. It's not so bad, Ellis replied. I like my peace and quiet, and now and then, someone like you shows up and makes things interesting. Interesting, she repeated, raising an eyebrow. Is that all I am? Interesting. Ellis grinned. For now. Ask me again once we get you flying. A small, reluctant smile crossed her lips. Fair enough. The two of them worked side by side, checking the final systems, ensuring everything was in place. Every so often, Avari would ask a question about the shuttle's design, about the colony, about Ellis's background. He answered each one candidly, his easygoing demeanor starting to put her more at ease. When the last system check was complete, Ellis stepped back and wiped his hands. "All right," he said. "She's as ready as she's gonna be." Avari looked at the control console, then at Ellis. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't expect to find someone like you here." "Someone like me?" Ellis echoed, arching an eyebrow. "Someone who could help," Avari said simply. Without question, without hesitation. He shrugged. "It's what I do." Avari held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "Well, thank you. Again." Ellis gave her a slight smile. "Just remember me when you're back on top of the galaxy. Yeah?" Her lips twitched upward briefly. "I'll keep that in mind." As she turned toward the cockpit, the tension that had lingered between them seemed to ease. Avari stepped into the pilot's seat, adjusting the controls. Ellis stayed back, watching her as she prepared for departure. Part of him wondered where she'd go, what kind of life awaited her out there. But he knew better than to ask. Some things were best left unknown. "Take care out there," he said, his voice low but clear. Avari glanced back at him. "You as well." The shuttle's engines hummed to life, filling the workshop with a steady vibration. Avari's gaze lingered on Ellis for a moment longer before she turned her attention to the controls. Then, with a soft lurch, the shuttle began to lift. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only a faint echo of sound and the fading glow of thrusters behind. Ellis stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the ship had been. Then, with a slow exhale, he turned back toward his workbench and picked up his tools. There were always more engines to fix. Avari stared at the holographic readout, her finger hovering over the control panel, as if the slightest movement might set off another chain of events she couldn't control. The ship was stable now. The modifications she and Ellis had worked on together had held during the test run, and she was close, so close, to being able to leave this remote colony behind. But instead of feeling relief, she felt conflicted. "You're overthinking it again." Ellis's voice cut in from behind her. She turned, her expression shifting into a practiced neutrality. He stood in the doorway of the shuttle's cockpit, a grease rag over one shoulder, his arms crossed in that relaxed way of his. It was a stance she'd come to associate with straightforward, sometimes maddeningly candid advice. "I don't overthink," Avari replied evenly. "Sure you don't," Ellis said, stepping inside and leaning against the co-pilot's seat. "You just stare at the same screen for 10 minutes without moving. That's not overthinking at all." Avari let out a small, sharp breath, somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. "I'm analyzing the data." "Analysis paralysis," Ellis said with a grin. "Come on. The ship's fine. We both know it." She shot him a look. "It's not your life on the line if something fails. And I'm telling you it won't fail," Ellis said, his voice calm but firm. "We checked everything twice. You've got more redundancies in this system now than most military cruisers. You're safe." The word safe made her bristle slightly. Safety wasn't something she had felt in a long time. Not since before her empire's collapse. Not since before she found herself relying on a human mechanic in the middle of nowhere. She turned back to the control panel, her fingers tapping a few buttons more out of habit than necessity. "I don't like to assume anything," she said quietly. "Every time I have, it's gone wrong." Ellis tilted his head, studying her. "I get that," he said after a pause. "But sometimes you just have to trust that you did the work, made the right call, and go for it." Avari's fingers stilled. She hadn't planned to say it, but the words slipped out anyway. "And what if I don't know how to trust anymore?" The silence that followed was heavier than she expected. When she finally looked at Ellis, his expression had softened. Not with pity, but with understanding. "You trusted me," he said simply. She didn't reply right away. She hated how vulnerable that admission made her feel. But he was right. She had trusted him, with her ship, with her safety, with the truth of her situation, even if she hadn't told him everything. And he hadn't let her down. "That's different," she said, her tone quieter now. "Is it?" Ellis asked. "Seems to me like it's the same. You put your trust in someone and hoped they wouldn't screw it up. And here we are." There was a faint edge of humor in his voice, but it wasn't mocking. If anything, it was reassuring. Avari shook her head slightly, a small, incredulous smile forming despite herself. "You have an infuriating way of simplifying things." "Just trying to help," Ellis said, his grin widening. She didn't know why she stepped closer. Maybe it was the exhaustion catching up with her, or the strange, unexpected comfort of having someone who genuinely seemed to care without asking for anything in return. Or maybe it was the realization that she didn't want to leave this place. Leave him without acknowledging what he'd done for her. "I should go," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Sure," Ellis said lightly, "just as soon as you stop staring at that screen." She let out a soft laugh, something she hadn't done in what felt like ages. And in that moment, the tension broke. For the first time since she'd arrived on this backwater colony, Avari felt like she could breathe, like she wasn't carrying the weight of her past entirely alone. "Ellis," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, waiting. He didn't move closer, didn't push, just waited for her to decide. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for once, she didn't second-guess herself. Their lips met softly at first, a tentative connection that quickly deepened as the barrier between them dissolved. Her hand brushed against his arm, his fingers hesitating briefly before resting at her waist. The kiss was unhurried, unspoken, and unlike anything Avari had ever known. It wasn't about power or status or obligation. It was simply two people finding solace in one another. When they finally parted, Ellis's expression was a mix of surprise and a small, sheepish smile. "Wasn't expecting that," he admitted. "Neither was I," Avari said, her voice steady but her gaze searching his. "Guess that means we're even," Ellis said. For a moment, they just stood there, the hum of the ship's systems filling the quiet. Avari's thoughts raced, but for once, she didn't feel the need to analyze them. For once, she let herself feel. Ellis glanced up from his toolbox as Avari entered the workshop. For the first time, she wasn't wearing the hood that had so often shadowed her features. She moved with a quiet confidence. Her usual guarded expression softened. Ellis caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, and he couldn't help but grin back. "Didn't expect to see you so soon," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Figured you'd be busy packing for wherever you're off to next." "I needed a break," Avari replied, her tone casual yet thoughtful. She leaned against the edge of the workbench, her fingers lightly tracing the grain of the worn surface. "Besides, I wanted to see how the adjustments held up." "They're solid," Ellis assured her. "That ship of yours is practically brand new. You could fly halfway across the sector without so much as a hiccup." Avari raised an eyebrow. "Halfway? Not the whole way," Ellis chuckled. "I'm a mechanic, not a magician. I can fix what's here, but I'm not going to guarantee the stars won't throw something unexpected your way." She tilted her head, studying him. "You really don't hold anything back, do you?" "Not much point in pretending," Ellis said, shrugging. "Especially out here. People either get what they need or they don't. No need for games." Avari seemed to consider that, then nodded. "I can respect that." For a while, they worked side by side, tinkering with a few small projects. Ellis handed her a wrench without her needing to ask, and Avari offered a steadying hand when a panel slipped out of place. It was a comfortable rhythm, one they had developed over the past few days. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind of quiet that grew between people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Eventually, Avari broke the silence. "You don't ask many questions about who I am or where I came from." Ellis glanced at her, then turned back to the circuit board he was inspecting. "You'll tell me what you want me to know. I figure if it's important, you'll bring it up. If not, it's not my business." "You're unusual," she said, Unusual good or unusual bad? Ellis asked, flashing a brief grin. I haven't decided yet, Avari replied, though there was a faint teasing tone in her voice. Ellis chuckled. Fair enough. I'll take undecided over bad any day. She looked down at the component she was holding, turning it over in her hands. I don't usually let people get this close. Why's that? Ellis asked, setting down his tools and giving her his full attention. Where I'm from, everyone expects something from me. Whether it's power, influence, protection, whatever it is, there's always an angle. It's exhausting. She hesitated, then added, I've learned it's easier to keep people at a distance. Sounds lonely, Ellis said quietly. It's necessary, Avari said, but even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. Maybe sometimes, Ellis agreed, but not all the time. Avari met his gaze, her sharp, intelligent eyes searching his face. And you? You don't keep people at a distance. Ellis leaned back against the bench. I don't know. Maybe I do. But I don't think about it as much as you seem to. I just deal with whoever shows up, one day at a time. She seemed to take that in, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she said, You make it sound simple. It's not, Ellis said, his tone soft. But sometimes it's worth the risk. Letting someone in, Avari looked down at the component in her hands again. She seemed lost in thought for a moment, then set it on the bench. When she looked back up, there was something different in her expression. Something warmer, more open. I think I'm beginning to understand what you mean, she said. Ellis smiled, but didn't push further. He could sense that Avari was working through her own thoughts, and he didn't want to rush her. Instead, he picked up a tool and started adjusting a nearby panel. Well, if you ever need a reminder, you know where to find me. She watched him for a moment, then nodded. I do. They fell into an easy silence again, the sound of their work filling the space. Ellis handed her another tool, and their hands brushed briefly. Neither of them pulled away. For the first time in a long while, Avari felt something close to comfortable. Not because she was in control or because she was certain of the future, but because she had found someone who didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. When they finished their tasks for the day, Avari lingered at the workbench, her fingers idly running along the edge. Ellis stood beside her, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. Thanks, she said quietly, glancing at him. For what? Ellis asked, genuinely curious. For being different, she replied. Ellis smiled faintly. I'll take that as a compliment. Avari nodded, her own faint smile forming. It is. The shuttle's engines rumbled to life, casting a faint orange glow over the workshop walls. Avari stood beside the open hatch, her hands brushing against the smooth frame of the doorway as she prepared to board. Ellis stood a few feet away, leaning against the workbench and watching her quietly. Neither of them spoke at first, the low hum of the engines filling the silence. You sure about this? Ellis asked, his voice steady but quiet. Avari turned to look at him. She still wore her usual calm expression, but there was something softer in her eyes. As sure as I can be. Ellis nodded. Well, the ship's ready. Systems are stable, fuel tanks are topped off, and that old regulator we replaced is holding up fine. I know, Avari replied, her tone light. I trust your work. He smirked at that. Took you long enough to say it. She raised an eyebrow, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. I've always trusted your work, Ellis. I just didn't say it. That's fair, he said, pushing off the workbench and stepping closer. You don't say much about what you're thinking. Old habit, Avari admitted. One that's hard to break. You've said enough, though, Ellis replied, meeting her gaze. Enough that I know you're not walking out of here without a reason. Her smile grew a bit more sincere, though it still carried a hint of sadness. You're right. I have a reason. I have responsibilities I can't ignore. People who are counting on me. You can still change your mind, you know, Ellis said gently. There's a quiet life here if you want it. No one's gonna chase you down. No one's gonna ask questions. Avari shook her head slowly. I can't. It's not in me to walk away from everything that happened. I have to face it. If I don't, I won't be able to live with myself. Ellis nodded again, taking her answer in stride. Then you'll do what you have to do. But you know where to find me if you ever want that quiet life. Avari stepped closer, standing just a foot away from him. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to say something more, but the words didn't come. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm briefly, a rare and deliberate gesture that caught him off guard. Ellis, she said softly, thank you for everything. He looked at her hand, then back at her face. You don't have to thank me. You're the one who put in the work. You're the one who's ready to face whatever comes next. I still couldn't have done it without you, she said. Ellis managed a small, lopsided smile. Well, you made the job interesting. I'll give you that. She let out a quiet laugh, a sound that carried both warmth and a touch of melancholy. Interesting, she repeated. I suppose I can live with that. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of the shuttle's engines seemed distant compared to the weight of the silence between them. Then Avari stepped back, her hand falling to her side. I should go, she said, her voice steady again. There's a long way ahead. Ellis watched her as she turned toward the hatch. Take care out there, he said. Avari paused at the threshold and glanced over her shoulder. You too. With that, she climbed aboard and closed the hatch behind her. The shuttle's engines grew louder as it lifted off, the glow of the thrusters reflecting off the workshop's walls one last time before disappearing into the night sky. Ellis stood there long after the shuttle was gone, staring at the spot where it had vanished. He wasn't sure if he'd ever see Avari again, but he knew she'd find her way, just as she always had. Turning back to his workbench, he picked up a wrench and returned to his tools. Life on the colony wouldn't stop, and neither would he.